I know more people are joining, but welcome. We do really appreciate you coming to learn more about secure AI deployment for businesses. My name is Kim Tan, and I work in Marco's marketing and sales operations. And so, just to cover some quick housekeeping items, we are essentially going to record this session. So, if you need to reference it, share it, we will send out email communication after the event, usually the following day, and that way you can have the recording. We post this on the website and YouTube. If you have any questions as we go along the presentation, please drop those into the chat and feel free to send them to me, the host, or the panelists, and we'll get to those as we have time at the end. We will have some polls today, so 2 polls, so we'd love for you to participate. So once that comes up, we'll basically start that, allow you to have 1 minute to answer, and then we'll share the results with everyone else. So just to kick it off, as I say, our 2 speakers today are Charles Brandt and Ben Bowman. And so we want to go ahead and introduce those to you. So Charles, if you'll go ahead and flip over and share your names, and then I'll let you 2, we'll start Ben first, and then Charles.
So thanks, Kim. Good morning, everybody. I'm the Security Operations Manager here at Marco Technologies. I oversee managed security services for our customers. So in areas of like EDR, MDR, and other technologies and things like that. Really, our goal is to help our customers operationalize cybersecurity. So digging through all the noise and finding the things that are actionable so that you, as our customers, can focus on the things that really matter. AI topic that's exciting and scary at the same time. So from my chair, it presents us with new challenges from an operations perspective because it is another technology that's out there that presents new inherent security risks that comes along with it. So excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Charles Brandt, Consulting Services Manager here at Marco. My team runs the fractional or virtual CIO and CISO services, and we're going through and helping customers and building out their infrastructure, their IT networks to support what they are going through today and also in the future. And along with that comes security program development as well. A lot of time working between the IT folks as well as the executive leadership teams, make sure we're aligning movement and also understanding how we can define success and roadmap that out. As far as AI is concerned, this has been coming up a lot of interest in how we can best deploy it, what considerations we need to take in place as we're rolling it out. And I'm happy to be going over this with everyone today. Look forward to some of the questions that are coming in. And we'll start by just looking at high level what we're going to cover today. So we'll start by diving into some of the business use cases that are commonly out there. One of the deployment models that we use in our consulting practice to help organizations understand, where to start if they're unsure about that, and how this typically progresses as it rolls out, and also some of those common deployment cybersecurity challenges that Ben had kind of mentioned as well, and how we can set ourselves up for success with regards to things like data handling and information protection labeling, maintaining compliance, and avoiding exposure of sensitive and confidential information.
Right. As I say, to start off, we're going to talk about AI for business enablement. So then the use of AI in business is now more mainstream, with many organizations implementing AI as a standalone technology for both specialized use cases or sometimes embedding it within their common enterprise software systems that handle those core business processes. Can you walk us through some of the benefits for AI for businesses?
Absolutely. So, to take this a little bit into context, I kind of look at this similar to the invention of the search engine when Google came along 20 or some odd years ago. It was an extreme jump in productivity because people could get access to information quickly with just a browser and just typing in a question. This is similar to that, but on steroids, really. So, on the screen here, we've got lots of different use cases, but, really the main factor is speed, efficiency, and scale. So think of, if we want to use task automation, for example, emails is a great example of this. A lot of us spent a lot of time in email and taking the time to type up responses, two questions, and we're concerned with getting the structure right, or the proper grammar and things like that. Or where to even start? How do I start with just drafting this message? And this AI is being integrated into a lot of business platforms to allow for just getting you started, right? I want to draft a response to this. Help me put something together and get it in a structure that makes sense to answer this question. But it's also in that able to interpret nuance and mood and attitudes of individuals just based on the grammar that's used in those email messages. So that's one use case that we're definitely seeing and starting to implement in different services as well to help us just be faster with our responses and to improve the efficiency of our communication with our customers. Programming is another area where this is getting used. So code creation is an item that's listed there. So, you may have this, let's say you're developing some kind of query that you're looking to run against a REST API or something like that to pull data outside of application. Well, this can help you kind of get started and say, hey, this is what a query that I'm looking to run. Here's the results I'm looking to gain out of that. Give me the structure for the code, and it'll help you get started and put that stuff onto the screen for you to get just a head start on it. So again, it helps with speed, efficiency, and scale. Analysis and insights. So if I think about if I'm going to write up a presentation, I might have a document or a report that's out there that's 400 some odd pages long, and I can reference that and say, hey, I'm looking to get some insights out of this. Tell me about this piece of it, or tell me about this statistic, and I'll help reframe that data in a way that is faster to get to in an intelligent way. If I were to speak specifically to cybersecurity and how our teams are able to use it, a lot of things that we look at from a threat landscape perspective, alerts that get generated might come from your firewall, might come from your users and how they're leveraging data and things like that. AI is able to help us correlate those alerts against each other to see if we can identify trends faster than what a human can. So there's lots of different ways in which this is starting to impact us from a business perspective.
That's great. So I was going to say, when we talk about, the two things that stand out for me for AI is what we hear a lot is ChatGPT, right? And Copilot. And so we're going to dive a little bit into Copilot. So can you just remind us and refresh us on what is Microsoft 365 Copilot?
Yeah, so it's a lot like ChatGPT, but in the Microsoft environment, right? If you've heard of ChatGPT, and I'm sure many of you have, it's based on large language models to start. So essentially, it's very deep learning models that are integrated in with this. That's pre-trained on vast amounts of data, and essentially underneath that, there's a transformer that includes an encoder and a decoder that enables it to have self-attention capabilities, is what we like to call it. So it's able to extract meanings from sequences of text and take those meanings and understand the relationships between words and phrases and things like that. And so basically, these large language models are capable of unsupervised training and self-learning. So taking that data and summarizing it and extracting that nuance to give you answers that are more nuanced than just providing, say, a link in a Google search and things like that. The second piece is Microsoft Graph, and this is basically a unified API that set up connectors for other applications to take your unstructured data and interact with that large language model. So stuff that might come out of, let's say, Microsoft Teams or SharePoint or other applications, Graph is able to take that unstructured data in to help that large language model learn off of it. But along with that, that's Microsoft 365 apps as well. So when you run a query inside Copilot, it's able to reach out to things like Teams and SharePoint and look for data that's out there and use that as a part of its response and gain nuance into your question based on the data that's available.
Right. So really, like, Microsoft Copilot really effortlessly integrates with it and operates within those Microsoft apps. So as you mentioned, you really get to have some great insights into a SharePoint or Teams or your messages or data that you have. Can you walk us through some foundational skills recommended for new users? So if they're starting to use this, what are some of these great foundational skills that they need to have for new users?
For sure. There's really a few different things that you can do to learn how to really interact with it. How I started learning with it was really experimenting, just asking it questions and seeing how it reacts to you, and just learning through doing. I think a lot of us are really visual learners or hands-on learners, and I don't think this is any exception. But beyond that, Microsoft Learn actually has some content out there that's free that you could go out and just review yourself and read that content, and even access some videos, short videos that are training tutorials and things like that on how to interact with Copilot to be able to do things like, summarizing a meeting or summarizing an email thread, or writing an email about, et cetera, kind of like the examples that are on the screen. But the big thing I would say is learning the structure of basic prompts. And Microsoft kind of lays this out in an article that I was able to reference to help structure those things. And one of those things is, uh, what is the goal of what you want Copilot to do? So maybe it's you want to create a list of something, or maybe in this case, you want to summarize an email thread. The second piece is context. What do you need? What is the reason that you need that action to be done, and telling Copilot that. And then also expectations. What do you want it to do? Maybe you want to tell it to respond with a friendly tone, but be maybe a little bit assertive or something like that, or something along those lines. And then also the source. What information do you want to pull it from? Maybe you want to pull it from Teams or SharePoints, or maybe there is an article that you want to reference for key points and data and things like that. So understanding that when you query it, it's not just typing in the name of somebody or typing in a specific subject. It's full sentences and asking it to do specific things, and more of a conversational approach to working with it.
That's really great because I use Claude, and so I feel like you can. Claude AI is a really good one to say, hey, I need it to be a friendly tone or be more concise or short or brief, right? So some of those prompts is really good. So we do have our first poll for the day, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that and open the poll. And so you're going to have 1 minute to answer. What is your organization's current stage of AI adoption? So are you currently planning and researching? And that's why this webinar is a great one to come to. Are you already in early implementation, maybe with some users, or maybe a core group of people? Are you in advanced implementation, or are you not considering AI at this time? So go ahead and type those answers in, and then you have 30 seconds approximately, and we'll go ahead and share those answers out with everybody. Looks like we are getting some, good amount of planning, researching. We have a good amount in early implementation. Only one person so far with advanced, and then we are having some people not considering AI at this time. So definitely skewing more towards the planning, researching, and some early implementation. And we have, go ahead and close that poll, and then we'll get that. It looks like we had half the people responded, and we can share those and apply those poll results for everyone, and hopefully you get to see that. So thank you guys for participating. We really appreciate that. So Charles, we're going to turn to you now. Ben talked about business benefits of AI tools, Microsoft Copilot, but how does an organization go about deploying this securely? Do we just go willy-nilly and just say, hey, we're going to give it to 5 people and here you go, have fun? Or do you plan this correctly and methodically?
Yeah, I mean, as we can kind of see in these polling results, I'm glad to see people are kind of going through and doing their planning, their research, or starting to roll this out and understanding that they're in the early stages, because it really is a process. So what we have here on the screen is a deployment model that we use on my team with the consulting practice to answer that question. Hey, we're really interested in turning this on or integrating this into our business processes, improving efficiency, but we're not really sure where to start. And one of the things that we really strive to push for all the engagements is bringing together those key stakeholders across the organization. We want to make sure that this isn't just happening in IT, right? We want to make sure that people are represented across the organization. They're going to have different perspectives on business use cases, even risks, as Ben mentioned. And really the best practice that we've seen kind of forming around this would be to build something like an AI council. Have that group that's looking at these things strategically and understands the risks, understands the business outcomes that you really want to achieve, and the KPIs that go along with it. If we roll this out, how do we measure success? How do we know that we're on the right track? And this group is really key in helping answer those questions. So we would call this more of an initiation phase. As you move into preparation, you've made a business commitment to move forward. I would start by doing something like a readiness assessment. Taking a really good, clean look at what kind of data do you have in your environment? How are you wanting to use it? Is there any compliance requirements around it? Do you have this documented? Ben talked about API connections. Do you have those documented? And it's not just technology, but it's also all the processes and procedures, the staffing that go around it. After this is either turned on or starting to be implemented, we really get into that adoption phase. It's not all going to happen at once. We really need to take the time to operationalize it, make sure that you're streamlining and integrating it into not only the technology, but the training, right? The processes, the policies, the change management, and oversight. And a lot of that comes back to a lot of things that Ben mentioned, right? Verifying that you are remaining compliant with how these tools are used and the data that it's accessing and how it's categorizing this, as well as maintaining security. If we see configuration drift, for example, that can open up a gap, and it can be a pretty significant risk for organizations. And again, if we have an AI council and the right people sitting on that oversight board, we can move that all the way into maturation, where we are seeing daily usage. We've seen that picked up by staff across the org. There are maintenance and monitoring techniques and tooling in place. And through that process, we can start to refine. We can look at our reporting and evaluate how it's doing and let that guide us along with the AI Council to move into growth and innovation. Start to see how we can move this further into the organization or allow it to scale up, or maybe to increase our productivity even further, or even launch new products.
That's great. So, Charles, a thoughtful approach for AI that includes the clear goal setting that you mentioned, a commitment to ethical standards. We haven't really said ethics yet, but there is that piece that comes in it with AI. And then also those continuous learning. All of that really unlocks tremendous opportunities for businesses, right, with the using the AI tool. But there's also potential risk, as both of you have mentioned, if there's no oversight. So you did mention the AI Council. Can you talk a little bit more about what is that and building one?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, key stakeholders from across the organization is definitely something that you're going to want to have on that playbook. We work with NIST standards and frameworks quite a bit. They put out a AI risk management framework that we referenced during our consulting sessions. There's other ones out there, but I think it simplifies it, and it really helps organizations maybe move forward without having to be so dependent on IT terminology. It looks at things in terms of risk and business enablement. So part of this is understanding, where do these tools live? Are there any ethical considerations that we really do need to consider? And we'll take a look at that in a second. Making sure we understand, what does compliance look like in our environment, and when are we potentially in breach of compliance? We're going to want to make sure that we have indicators that might be a risk that we are seeing coming to pass, or maybe we've gone past that point and we have to notify the appropriate parties. And then as changes are made throughout the organization, there has to be some actual process in place to make sure that, if you need to roll back, if you need to see the implications of this potential alteration and configurations, for example, what are the potential operational impacts of that, financial impacts of that. And then there's a lot of training and adoption resource support that really should go along with this. Some of the biggest security issues we see, some of the biggest adoption issues we see is when staff that are kind of required to maybe start using this don't feel like they really have a good understanding I absolutely agree with Ben that getting hands-on and playing around with these tools is a really good way to get acclimated to them and understand the power that they kind of bring into our tool set. But at the same time, we want to, as an organization, make sure that we're providing adequate training so that they can adhere to data security policy, right? And making sure that they're using the company confidential information in a way that aligns with the business policies that we have.
Right. And so, as I say, bringing up those ethical concerns, right, or those potential harms, as I say, the NIST ARC frames that and gives some information. And so we pulled this from there. So can you just walk through some of the things that they say, hey, these might be some potential harms that you need to think about as you're deploying this or considering it?
Yeah, and I think one of the big things that I like about this is just to bring it out of the technology space and understand that data that we hold as organizations and how we use it does potentially have an effect on the people within our organizations, the people that are our stakeholders, our customers, our clients outside the organization, uh, the profitability, operation, status of our organizations, and even the larger ecosystem that we as a potential vendor live in. Just some examples, that I like to bring up would be, if you are involved in health, for example, you're going to be hosting and protecting, you're in charge of a lot of protected health information or PHI. How we use that information as an organization to do things like predictive analytics with machine learning. Now, there are some implications to that, and we need to make sure that there's safeguards and guardrails around that. Using a framework like this can help us understand that. The other example that might come up is, if you're in finance or banking, loan processing, insurance processing, the models that you're using for your business and your metrics and how that might underwrite a policy or apply to a loan, um, they are obviously going to affect people. So we want to make sure that the data that we're using is accurate and the models that we're using are accurate and unbiased. There are definitely examples where that may not be the case, right? Whether it's through not a large enough data set that we're using to train those models, through corrupted data or incomplete data. One of the threats that AI has is even just producing information that is incorrect or misleading, that it's very confident in, but it's not accurate. We would call those hallucinations, AI hallucinations. So something to look at as you're looking at potential harms. And then, one of the things I know Ben and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and we'll be discussing it a little bit later, is the potential situation where you have a threat actor in your environment using these, company authorized tools against you.
Yep. Well, that leads into our next question, the next poll that we're going to have. So I'm going to go ahead and open that right now. So the question we have for you is, do you have any policies at your organization governing the use of licensed environments like a Microsoft Copilot or any non-sanctioned environments? Like I said, I mentioned a ChatGPT or Cloud AI or any other tool that's out there for AI deployment and development. So just a reminder, you do have 1 minute to answer. And it looks like we are getting some people. Looks like more leaning toward no, we don't have any policies in place right now, but we're getting a good smattering across all of those. So unsure. Whoever's that one person that has the policies in place. Oh, it's two now. We'll give them a thumbs up for that. Good job.
And we do a lot of policy writing, Kim, and I'd say this is one that's come up more and more. It's heading towards the top of the list of the inquiries that we get. Well, where do we start with something like this? What kind of considerations do we need to keep in mind when we're writing these policies? What's realistic?
Correct. We'll go ahead and share those results. So it looks like we do have two people that do have policies in place. Four people did mention they have some policies. We're in the process is 11, and then no, we don't have any 25. So good smattering across that. And so let's talk about AI and data privacy. So lead into that liability side, the risk side of the house. So Ben, we just polled our attendees to see if they have any of those policies. But question for you before we dive into this slide, why do we need policies around AI use? Maybe a silly question, but I think a good one to answer.
I think it's an important question to ask, though. And I like to think of it just in terms of just technology use in general. Any and all technologies with it carry inherently some type of risk or security challenge. If we look at just the basic user account and access to a user account and the passwords and things like that, most companies they make the effort to say, hey, as a policy, it's on you as an end user to protect your credentials, not share your user account and password with other individuals so that other people can gain access to it and then potentially use your user account to access things that they're not authorized to do. So I kind of look at this in terms of shadow IT as a term, and that I'm sure many of you have heard before, but the concept of a user, wanting to make their life easier and looking for their own tools to help them do their job more effectively. So if we look at the use of AI in particular, this is one of those things that it carries a lot of risk because, every employee wants to, stay efficient and be able to get things done faster and get to the answer that they need quicker and things like that. So I think shadow IT in the realm of AI is going to become a very prominent concern. With that, if a user goes out and says, "Hey, I need an AI chatbot to help me be able to review this data and summarize this information, potentially take corporate information that is protected or confidential and put that into an AI chatbot and ask it to manipulate that data." Well, if it's in as we'd say, non-sanctioned or non-business sanctioned AI chatbot, that data is now out in the wild. So it's something to definitely consider. Policies help kind of set the stage, right? They're the governing documents or governing information that kind of dictates what the culture for the organization is going to be around information security and cybersecurity. So it's important to have those in place so that they can serve as that governing framework to instruct and inform your company, your end users, et cetera, exactly on what is considered proper and improper use.
That's perfect. And that really just naturally leads into this next question, what we have on the slide. So, what are those data privacy and security challenges linked to AI?
I think a lot of it is really based on old concepts, but in a new format, right? Uh, when we look at AI, or just data access in general, what does a user actually have access to? So if we think of Copilot inside of an environment, what does that user have access to? What data, what type of documents, what sites, what 365 groups, things like that. So when we think about, data privacy and security, and we talk AI, well, the question is underlying of those prompts that the user is entering into AI is what data do they have access to? Because they could inadvertently find things that they didn't know they had access to, confidential information, financial information, customer information, and things like that. So it's, again, I'll go back to this example. It's a little bit of, the invention of Google for the public internet to find information that's readily accessible on the internet. Now you've just created, or we've just added in essentially that Google on steroids for an internal environment to quickly sift through all the data that's there and gain access to it. So it's definitely a major privacy concern, and it's something where users that you don't know have access to certain files could then find that data and then misuse it because insider threats are still a major concern for security teams.
That's great. So our next slide that we're going to talk about really just shows the architecture the data lifecycle management. So how things could come in terms of data, how they enter, how it gets generated, how it leaves or is destroyed. So can you walk us through that when it's like data lifecycle in the frame of or the lens of AI?
Definitely. So, the goal of data lifecycle management really is, we got to maintain the integrity and accuracy of that data. How do we collect it? How do we store it? How do we process it? And when you look at data from an AI perspective, it's a combination of factors. What type of data is it? Is it labeled? Do we understand what types of data we have? Is this sensitive? Is this confidential? Where's the source of this coming from? But then beyond that, there's a compliance element to this. Certain documents you need to keep around for a certain amount of time, but then after that amount of time, from an organizational risk perspective, it's important to purge that information because keeping it around might be more of a risk to the organization just by having it because it's no longer of use and it's beyond its useful life. So by having some of those data lifecycle management pieces in place, it prevents, kind of in the end of that slide there, from it leaving those sanctioned applications, from it leaving those cloud environments, and being accessed by people that might not be authorized to access it, or having it prematurely destroyed before it's supposed to be destroyed. Maybe it's a financial document we're supposed to keep around. It's not properly tagged and we delete it prematurely on accident. That's where these practices come into play and so are so important.
That's great. The next slide is the architecture around it. And I thought this one was really interesting, just to see how things are in that 365 service boundary, I'm going to call it. So Ben, can you walk us through this slide and how this works with Microsoft Copilot?
Really, I'll keep it kind of high level because these Microsoft architecture slides can look a little bit complicated, but the process at a high level is it really starts out where if you have Copilot enabled in your 365 applications, let's say Word or PowerPoint, they have the ability to prompt Copilot directly from those applications. So they may enter in a prompt at that point. Copilot receives that information and pre-processes that input. And it does that through an approach called grounding, which improves the specificity of that prompt, helps look for contextual information so that it can help reframe the question based on the things that it already knows. So if you ask it one thing, it might look at that prompt and then based on the things that it's already have learned, recontextualize the question so it can understand it. Copilot then sends that prompt to the large language model itself for processing. And then Copilot only with this, when we talk about the security concerns I mentioned before, this is where that least privilege access comes into play. It will only prompt the Copilot only accesses data that user is able to access. So this is where that comes into play. Do you have proper user access controls in place? Are there proper groups around that data and assigned to that data, et cetera? So it's going to query against that data. Once the large language model itself responds to Copilot, it does other things like doing responsible AI checks. It does a review of security, compliance, and privacy policy reviews and things like that to make sure that certain data types aren't being presented that it shouldn't be, and then presents that back to the user in a format based on those combination of factors.
Perfect. And I did mention that 365 service boundary because on the slide we can see like Bing and plugins and other things like that. So what's the importance of having that service boundary and then the things that are sort of outside it, like a search engine, Bing, for example?
Definitely. The service boundary itself can be a variety of different components that can be all combined up into a central approach for how the data itself how the data itself flows between the different areas. So first being data residency and compliance. Where's that data residing itself? So if we were to think of things like GDPR in the European Union, right? GDPR is a much more strict regulation than some of the areas in the United States, maybe not including California or New York, where the guidelines are a little bit more stricter or more strict. So that's important. Where does the data reside in which areas of Azure, things like that? Service scope is another area in this. So is it available in certain regions or certain customer segments? So government entities, they have a different service scope than, say, education, for example. And then inter-service interaction based on region or tenant. So what's the data flow between different applications or how do they integrate? I mentioned security and compliance already. And then subscription boundaries, maybe in certain subscriptions, data can't traverse between one subscription to another for different purposes or they have different coverage inside those subscriptions.
Great. Well, that question around the service boundary really leads into the file labeling, I think, really well. So within an organization, especially as it gets bigger, I think it's more crucial to understand where that sensitive data lies, as you both have mentioned, where it can move, right? And who has a true business need to access that, right? So we don't get to have, everyone doesn't get to have admin rights, right, for our organizations. So when we talk about data tagging or labeling and also around data loss protection and deploying AI, how does that all fit together, Charles?
Yeah, I put together a very simple example here. This is an everyday situation that we're going to run into. Copilot operating within that service boundary, as Ben mentioned, is going to pull from a disparate number of files, right? So public, potentially company internal, or we consider sensitive information, maybe some of that higher level sensitivity, like confidential information. It's going to pull it into that whole process that Ben mentioned, and as it's bringing the output to the user, the person who prompted it, we're going to want to make sure that it's in holding the integrity to the highest regard. So in this case, if it pulled information from public, sensitive, and confidential information, going through that process of labeling that file confidential because it is the highest level. Now, again, this is going to be dependent on whether or not your labeling practices are in place and if they're adhered to. There's many ways to do this. We'll discuss a few of them later. Ben also mentioned, data retention policies and how those can kind of play into this whole equation as well. But even things just like having a data classification and labeling policy in place, making sure that it is applied to documents either manually by default or using some higher end auto classification licenses, which we'll cover a little bit later. And what this allows us to do is make sure that as data is leaving potentially the environment through, say, email or being uploaded to a certain application, that the processes and systems and solutions like DLP, data loss prevention, that are in place are stopping it at the border, essentially, and going, oh, you're not allowed to leave here, or you're not allowed to leave here unencrypted, or in more advanced cases, I'm just going to kind of jump to this next slide. Purview, which is a more advanced governance, risk, and compliance tool, data information protection tool, can actually jump into these files with the right licenses, look and classify them automatically, depending on the license you have, based on what it's seen. So maybe it's making sure that anything labeled confidential is appropriately labeled, and then when it goes through, DLP is able to catch it. Ben mentioned some really good points on how users tend to interact with these tools. One is copying and pasting information from output into new files. We want to make sure that there's something in place that in that occurrence, it's at least getting a default label, or in maybe some of those higher level licenses, Purview is auto classifying that based on the information that's actually included in that document. And then again, it's potentially leaving the environment or being accessible to applications that upload that to the internet or anything crossing that service boundary that it's getting stopped.
Perfect. I was going to say, I like the addition of the purview in here. And Ben, I'll ask you a quick question. So, can you walk us through? I had not heard of purview before, right? So, new tool for me when we were doing research around this. So, can you talk about how that relates to Microsoft Copilot? I feel like Charles touched on it, but I'd like you to dive a little bit deeper into it.
Definitely. Purview is definitely it's kind of like data loss prevention on steroids, is kind of how I like to look at it. But basically, it gives you the opportunity to identify what data you have, and in some cases, you can enable auto tagging to at least give you a start on identifying what data is there and applying sensitivity labels to certain data based on the content within it. Uh, but it also gives you the ability to granularly dig in and say, based on these sensitivity labels that we assign to these certain documents, we can restrict access and things like that. But it also can be done based on SharePoint or team sites, 365 user groups, document libraries, users themselves. And it gives you kind of a 10,000 foot view over the data itself to say, hey, these types of data, I want to have them labeled this way, or this document library in its entirety. I want it labeled this way. And it gives you that ability to control the data at that scale, which is becoming more important because 365, that data is referenceable in multiple applications and areas. But it can provide you a visibility of data loss prevention alerts, insider risk management alerts, matches against your communication compliance policy, or give you some information, contextual information on e-discovery and things like that. But from a security side of things, it just gives us visibility into what data is there and what activities might be infringing against the policy based on the things that we set within it.
Right. So I think that lens of visibility it's such an important thing, especially when it comes to the security side. So when I saw this slide, I was like, ooh, Copilot benefit. We can find data quicker within our Microsoft tenant. Ooh, this slide shows me, wow, that's a risk, right? So, well, how does a threat actor accomplish, if there's a business email compromise, for example, what are the risks that come around with this threat actor scenario and then adding Copilot into that environment?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kim. And I think, going back to some of the points that Ben mentioned earlier about the current techniques that threat actors are using in our environments, a lot of the times it's living off the land or using the existing tool sets that we have to bypass our traditional cybersecurity tools. Very prevalent in the essence, kind of using our own tools against us. So it's important that we understand as we roll out new technologies if there's any inherent risks, and having an account compromised that does have access to Copilot, especially if they have access to a large amount of data, is a risk that companies should be aware of and document and structure their cybersecurity tooling, their policies, and their oversight against. So, in this situation here, as Ben kind of dived into a little bit earlier, there's a massive amount of information that this tool has available. You can set for these AI tools, and what it's really good at is kind of looking at that needle in a haystack, right? It can do it very, very quickly, and in just a way that traditional threat actors might take months to actually find this information, to sift through everything. If you have Copilot hooked up to these data sources, they're going to use it the same way we do, just to get very quick observation and synthesizing information to something that's useful. So, for instance, you might put in queries related to financial information. We work with companies going through mergers and acquisitions. We talked about health companies earlier, protective health information. Even in some circumstances, you might have people storing passwords in clear text, just in regular plain text in their Word documents. So if they have access to that, there's a chance that threat actor can kind of parse out that information super quickly and kind of wrap it all up and get it ready to exfiltrate or take out of the environment. So just some things to be aware of. Ben, from your side of it, I'm sure, working in the security operations center, you got some similar concerns, maybe about the benefits and risks.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the most common type of attack is business email compromise today, and that starts with user account credential compromise and just exchanges inside of 365 hosted in Azure at this point. So that's a concern, right? If they gain access to that user account, they're able to access whatever that user is able to access through Copilot at that point in time. So for us, it's definitely a new challenge. When we talk about, if we just say, when we look at security in general, a lot of our customers come to us and they subscribe to our managed security service, and they say, all right, I've got security services through you, and the conception can often be that, well, we pay you for our security now. You should be able to see everything that's going on. Well, there's challenges with that, right? Especially when we're talking about data exfiltration or data loss prevention, DLP, as I had mentioned before. So that data is no longer sitting inside of the customer environment. One way we could tell if data was being exfiltrated before was just based on volume that we could see going out through the firewall. If we saw a lot of data in volume going out, that's usually an indication that something's happening. But in this case, sitting inside 365, we can't necessarily see that volumetric data all the time. And the other challenge with that is that if there's no sensitivity labels assigned to it either, then things like data loss prevention don't necessarily work, right? Users might be just interacting with their files. They might be copying and pasting and pulling out that data and type things like that. But from a security operations perspective, that data we can't tell if it's necessarily stuff that should be leaving the environment and stopping that information. We're more looking for user account context. Is this user logging in should they be logging in from the location they should be logging in, or from the time of day that's typical for this user? So the kind of the future for us in security operations is the more that we can get organizations using things like Purview to identify and tag this data, the more visibility that we'll be able to get to be able to tell when there's suspicious activity going on.
That's great. And that ties in, and good job on tying right into our next slide, which is a little bit of a deeper dive into Microsoft Purview. So Charles, I'll let you handle this.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know we kind of went through some of these. I know that we work with a lot of companies that also use business premium licenses. A lot of the Purview licensing, as we'll see here, is based on E3 and E5 licensing. But to Ben's point, making sure you have sensitivity level in place is going to be a key start to the journey. Business premium also allows you to do manual default and mandatory sensitivity. So I wanted to mention that. It also does have some of those data loss prevention tooling capabilities in place for emails and files, as well as some of those discovery searching options. As we move down the licensing, E3 adds on to that. Start to get the ability to handle larger companies and organizations. Generally under advanced data loss prevention and more advanced data labeling options as well. So as you get to that E5, it gets pretty interesting. You can start to do things like that auto discovery, auto classification that we talked about, advanced compliance monitoring. Even at E3, you'll start to tie in and integrate to some of the compliance tools, security products that Microsoft offers. Some of the third parties like DLP exists in other vendors as well, like Varonis. They sometimes bolt right on, for example, into Purview. So there's some interesting things to value with companies. And then communication compliance policies is pretty interesting as well. I know Ben touched on that, but like Copilot prompting rules, right? If what are we not allowed to put in there? What keywords are we kind of paving to reload? So that is a pretty high level overview. Microsoft licensing does get pretty complicated quick, but luckily we have a lot of folks here at Marco. If you do have questions, you can always reach out as a next step and dive a little bit deeper if you want to.
Perfect. That sounds great. And as we're coming to the end of our time, so we're getting close, I did want to just mention, Charles, as in say, people, might want to say, hey, I want to look at, we're still planning and researching. I want to talk to somebody at Marco about this or doing that readiness assessment that you mentioned. So can you just quickly go through, so like, how could we help if someone does need help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, when we first started, we do fractional or virtual CIO and CISO services. And we have those industry experts that kind of live and breathe this every day that are really put in place to jump into companies, work with folks that are having those types of questions to help them move forward. Again, some of the biggest, most common things that we run into are those, today, those AI policies, those data security policies. What are we classifying in our environment? How are we labeling it? Some of the information security policies that surround the larger program. So anything like that is on the radar. Absolutely can help with that. And then even as you're going through your security program development, incident response planning and how it pertains to some of this, that is definitely becoming more key, as Ben kind of alluded to. And then even just a readiness assessment, how are we answering that first question with the council? We'll kind of dive into, what kind of data do we have? Where is it in our environment? What kind of tooling do we have to protect that? And if that day should come that we do have an incident, how are we positioned to contain it as quickly as possible and move into response and recovery? Really, that in this cybersecurity framework in action, our CISOs are really specialized in answering those questions. So if any of that sounds like something that's on your roadmap, you can always reach out to myself or your rep, Pam.
That sounds great. Well, we do have time for Q&A, so it looks like we have a little bit under 10 minutes. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please drop those into the chat. And people have been conversing with me, so appreciate everyone asking some really good questions that we can answer. The first one, Ben, that someone had is, we have M365 licenses now. However, I don't see any Copilot features in Excel or Word, or not seeing that. Is there a step that companies need to do to actually turn this on?
Yeah, sometimes there definitely can be. There's different licensing package that might not have it included. So I believe, it's been a while since I've gone too deep in 365 licensing, as as we all know, it's complex. But I believe Microsoft 365 Standard, for example, doesn't have it embedded in. So it really depends on the licensing model itself and can be licensed separately. But in a lot of packages, it will include it as a part of it. Another factor to consider is I have seen various reports where they might have the license and it just doesn't show up yet. So you might have to actually go into the app itself and then go to a file account and then click update license to actually be able to have it active in there. Oh, the other piece that I was just trying to think of it. The other piece is you might actually have to assign the license directly to the user itself. I don't believe it does so automatically, so that's something else to consider.
That's great. Ben, we did have another question that came in, and I think this one I'm going to throw to you. Which security measure or measures do you think is most critical when it comes to AI deployment?
Yeah, when I look at that, least privilege access first and foremost, that's definitely something to consider. Yeah, even outside of just using, like we mentioned, purview and sensitivity levels and things like that, making sure that users don't have access to document libraries in SharePoint they shouldn't, things like that. Least privilege access, I think, it's always been important, but now it's becoming more so important because it's becoming so easy to really comb through the data that's available. Multi-factor authentication, that's a given no matter what. So we talked about that scenario earlier regarding business email compromise. The first way to prevent a threat actor from using Copilot against you is to protect the user account itself. Multi-factor authentication is just no longer optional at this point. It's something that's really a necessity in protecting user accounts itself. And then, of course, purview is always an option that's out there, but it is a significant undertaking, and that's something that is always something that our team at Marco can help and assist with as well.
That's great. Those are good points. Charles, we had a question that came up. Our organization has deployed Microsoft, but we're struggling to verify compliance. So what should they do first?
It's really a question. Compliance is one of those things that can really have an effect if you fall outside of that, right? You might have breach notification. You might have some contractual requirements to be fulfilling these things. So, yeah, make sure if you are falling into compliance, you're looking at what you can do to set yourself up for success. I would go back to the AI Council and that kind of deployment model that we had talked about earlier, making sure that you're understanding first and foremost what kind of data you're holding, specifically in the terms of compliance. What falls under that umbrella and how are you required to protect it? To go back to what Ben said about principle of least privilege, role-based access, integrating that into the roadmap as well. It does have some business impact. Anytime we roll out security, it's going to have some business impact. But as we've seen here today, you could be the most trustworthy person in the entire organization. But if you have access to too much data, that can be a lot. And then roadmap, right? Look at your gaps, whether it's you conducting a readiness assessment internally or working with an outside party like my team Marco, and then setting yourself up to have those conversations, between IT and the executive team, making sure you're all on the same page, understanding that if you do need additional solutions or licensing staff and the training that they're on the roadmap and they have the appropriate budget and resources earmarked for them. And obviously, if you're having trouble answering any of that, uh,
Reach out and let's have a conversation for sure. So Ben, this is a really good one. How often should we update our AI security protocols and practices? So let's say that we decide to deploy this, we go through the deployment model. How often should we be looking at this?
Yeah, policies in general, the general rule of thumb that I've used in the past is at least updating those policies annually, as just part of recurring review of them to make sure they're still accurate, they're still in alignment with maybe your local regulations, things like that. But it's something, again, it doesn't have to wait till that annual review. If there's something that doesn't align with policy, it's always something that could use a mid-year update. It's better to do things in the moment than wait and have it be forgotten as well. But traditionally, at least annually, going through and reviewing those, and those policy reviews then will, oftentimes kick off discussions around what are our standards, what are our procedures, those types of documents that are outside that, and those things, update continuously and make sure that as you identify gaps in your security posture, take the time to make those changes as they come up, because it's oftentimes hard to go back and revert back. One thing I'll say on this, because it kind of ties into policy as well, because we've said least privilege access here quite a bit. One of the things when we look at from an operations perspective, a monitoring perspective, is that least privilege access is something that's really a conversation to have. It's something that, Marco as an organization is not going to have the context all the time as far as what users should have access to what data and how your business processes operate. So if there's something that falls down into that and there's something that a user is accessing that they shouldn't, we're not always going to be able to tell because they might have that authorization to a specific file. They might not. That's a business conversation and something that we can definitely have with you to see if there are things that we can do to assist in implementing those least privilege practices appropriately.
That sounds good. And I don't know who wants to take this one, but do you have one of our attendees asked, do we have any examples of a Copilot SOP that can be used as a reference when making their own? So Charles, did you want to take that one or Ben?
Yeah, Ben, you might have some additional input on this. I think, Microsoft has put together a couple of resources that I recommend people start investigating. They have the AI Copilot Success Kit. It's a really good one to start walking through. They have some of those in there. I wouldn't say they're SOPs per se, but they are a good list to start working your way through as you're answering those critical questions, getting your business set up right to move forward. And then, if you have account on Microsoft Learn, there is quite a bit of information on there in video format, instructional format. I do highly recommend if you're in charge of this area of your business, dive in there a little bit. There's a lot of really good documentation on deploy these tools and what kind of the standards that should be taken into place when you're going through your configuration.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one question because we have a minute. So can you restrict Copilot from accessing confidential data stored in SharePoint Online on OneDrive and other Office online sources? So does it have to be tagged, or can you immediately say, no, I don't want it to access this portion of SharePoint, for example?
That's a good question. I know you can do it from a sensitivity label perspective, like you mentioned, where, it can be prevented or users can be prevented from accessing confidential data if it's tagged at a global tenant level. That one I'm not 100% confident on, and maybe Charles, you have additional context there.
Yeah, there are some ways to limit the scope of everything, but I would say as you're going through that, make sure you know where everything is stored, what you want accessed and what you don't. It's probably not going to be as fine tunable as you might think it is, but there are some restrictions you can put on what is accessed.
Perfect. Well, great. As I say, we ended on time. Just want to again thank everyone for coming. Hopefully this was some good, useful information. As I mentioned, we are recording this and we will send out the recording, and then the team will share out some of those AI Success Adoption Kit, some of those links that we mentioned. So those will be part of the resources that we share out with everyone as well. And thank you. And then hopefully you have a good rest of your day. And thank you, Charles and Ben. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.